Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Kvetching with Adam and Jared. I am Jared, of course, and that is...
I'm Adam, and this time Jared has a beard. Jared
Yeah,
grew a beard specifically for this podcast, right?
yeah. Adam said it came up suddenly, but had he seen me yesterday and the day before and the day before that, he would have seen, gradual facial hair growth. So
Yeah,
it
well, I
didn't
didn't see
suddenly appear.
that. I didn't see any of that. I think that you were trying to model yourself after Ben Shapiro to just suddenly show up with a beard.
I've never seen him with a beard, so no, I don't take fashion cues from Ben Shapiro.
Ah,
I don't like
okay.
his rendition of quoting lyrics from songs. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that with Ben Shapiro.
All right, but
Uh,
we have a
we,
guest.
we have a
Let's
very special guest here tonight who's going to introduce herself in a second, Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky. And I'm only going to throw in, I always have to throw in something before the guest starts introducing themselves, that Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky's father-in-law, Mikhail Shufutinsky is a very eminent Russian singer, dating back at least till the 80s, if not earlier. And I remember in the 90s sitting in a cafe in Tbilisi, Georgia, and hearing one of his songs. I think it was Simnatsa Tam Gadu, come on the radio, and I really liked it. And then my Georgian girlfriend was there. I said, "Who is this?" And she told me. And she said she thought he was from the Caucasus, but he's not. He's actually, a Jewish musician from somewhere up north in Russia.
Yeah,
She got his biography wrong. But anyway, so, obviously when I met Brandy for the first time, I asked if there was any relationship because Shufutinsky is not exactly a common Russian name. And lo and behold, there's a familial connection. So we will turn the mic over to Brandy now, and she will tell us a little bit about herself.
thanks. I'm glad to be here with you guys. And I think by way of introducing myself, I'm actually going to sing one of his songs. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, I was getting excited for a second. Do you speak Russian? Do you know Russian?
No.
Are your kids
I
being
know a few, bad words and
are your kids being raised with Russian at all?
they were a little bit. My oldest two actually taught themselves how to read the Cyrillic alphabet, but they Hebrew, Spanish, and English mostly.
Okay, well, it's good. It's several languages.
Yeah.
Right, so go on with your introduction now that the song is over.
All right, so I'm director of education and community engagement with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and what that means is I'm super busy because I work a lot on issues that we see coming up in education related to, of course, anti-Semitism, but also just overall ideology that is fueling a lot of anti-Americanism and anti-Western thought that we're seeing propagated in American K-12 schools.
That's your entire biography? Okay, that's fine.
That's what I do professionally.
How did you get into that? Before we start talking about what we do.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Southern California. Born and raised in Southern California. Oh, really? Where?
San Diego.
Okay, so I was born in Upland in the Inland Empire, and then I went to high school in Santa Monica.
I went to the Claremont Graduate University for my PhD.
Yeah, but you're from Ohio, though.
I live in Ohio now, but Upland is right where I used to live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was born there, 1976. I lived in San Diego also for about 10 years. As an adult, my husband was in the Navy, so we moved all over the place, but ended up back in Southern California a couple of times. And for most of my professional life, I've worked in victim advocacy. I'm a social worker. I worked with victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, working within mostly the military community. So a lot of military families, active duty service members, and family advocacy programs, which also address things like suicide ideation, prevention, suicide response, substance abuse, family, new parent support, those types of things like social services. And I decided to go back to school once again and pursue my doctorate in international multicultural education. And I went to the University of San Francisco. So for 2 years, I commuted I live right outside of Philly now, from Philly to San Francisco every other week to attend classes until COVID let me do it on Zoom as I was finishing up my dissertation. And when I was in my doctoral program, I actually got a firsthand front row seat look to what teachers were being taught, which really was a lot of Paulo Freire, a lot of glorification of neo-Marxist ideology and violent activists, if you want to call them that, as kind of being put up as the standard of what students should be taught and how they should pursue justice. And I became greatly concerned, not because people hold those beliefs, but that was pretty much all that was being taught in 98% of the courses I took. And so there was a lack of diversity of thought and lack of just viewpoint diversity. And so, of course, me being a little bit contrarian and salty would pose questions to my professor, because so much of what was being taught actually contradicted itself. And there seemed to just not really be an answer or a desire to engage in dialogue and in debate. And so around that same time, I became aware of the ethnic studies problems that were coming into California. And then I started recognizing that same ideology, but coming in different programs in schools across the United States. And one of the really common responses that I got from a lot of people just said their parents were like, oh, well, this isn't going to happen here because I live in a red state, or this isn't going to happen here because our governor's a Republican. And I was like, oh, if, only it were that easy. It's not. The teachers all go to very similar teacher education programs they're being taught very similar things. And so I was seeing a lot of the similar ideology, lack of viewpoint diversity, identity politics coming into schools all over the country. And yes, red states and in places where the elected officials were Republican.
Is it because of the school boards that you think the problem is?
Partially, I honestly think the root of the problem are the teachers' colleges and schools of education. I think that they were probably the first ones captured by an ideology that doesn't allow dissent, because from that, you get then how many teachers graduate with their credential every year and go into the schools and teach how many hundreds of thousands to millions of students across the country.
Yeah, it's
Well,
a problem. I've
boards
sensed
have-
that education programs are really ground zero for so much of this stuff,
But in
and
terms
especially
of
with the influence they have. Sorry, go ahead.
for establishing a curriculum, though, that the teachers are ultimately beholden to the state, right? And school boards.
No,
All right.
if only. No. So the states will mandate, state boards of education at the state level, they'll mandate standards. But in many states, many of them, districts determine their own standards and curricular requirements for graduation.
Huh.
So as long as it falls within the general guidelines of the state level standards, districts do that. So districts can determine that they want to change, for instance, their American history class that so many 11th graders have to take into some form of ethnic studies class where they learn nothing about United States history. And that's one of the things we're seeing. So even if the state does have a history requirement for graduation, if a local district changes the history class to, maybe it has history in the name, maybe it doesn't, but it no longer resembles anything of the sort of what, standard American history class that we think most 11th graders take, they're able to do that. And then in order to do that, they bring in outside community organizations, many of which are activist organizations, to provide the teacher training and to provide the curriculum development.
Well, I mean, just I live in a red state, but it's North Carolina, so it's one of the more northern red states or southern states, and just near as I can tell from what I understand, and having had kids go through the educational system here, it seems there's a constant war going on at these school board meetings, and it's conservative parents coming in, and in these parts, very religious parents, coming in being outraged at some of the things that are being taught in the school or being threatened to be added to the curriculum. So I guess the state's control in that sense is not really that significant as you suggested. And but I looked at my daughter's history classes that she was taking. Yes, they were facile and simplistic in every respect, but it is high school or middle school or whatever, and so that's to be expected. But I didn't notice anything hyper woke in what she was being taught. So I think here, at least, the education is safe. But I don't know how much high school kids really pay attention in these classes anyway. I know I didn't. So.
I think a lot of professors getting the incoming, freshman class or finding that out.
Yeah. Oh yeah. God. Yeah. Yeah. So how did you transition from that to JILV?
So I started doing some work with an organization, which I still do some work for, called the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies. And they work closely on some aspects with JILV. And so that was really just kind of the connection, how I got started there.
Mm-hmm. And what does JILV, do concretely? I mean, you've said it in a very abstract way what it does. And when we had David Bernstein on, what's his position exactly?
He's the founder and executive director.
Yeah, the first David Bernstein.
James David Bernstein,
David L. Bernstein.
Yeah. We've had two of the three David Bernsteins on. He talked mostly about his book, Woke Anti-Semitism, but he didn't talk as much about JILV. So if you could tell us a little bit more about the organization, that would be terrific.
Sure, I will try. So we, as an organization, we look at mostly at two things. One is shifting the conversation within the internal Jewish organizational world to acknowledge the ideology that is fueling anti-Semitism. So the kind of extinction of viewpoint diversity, the insistence on the adoption of this narrow orthodoxy, that type of council culture ideas, to get the internal Jewish organizational world to recognize that that is happening and to combat it. So for instance, and this is my take, not the organization's take, there's my disclaimer. One of the main Jewish organizations changed the definition of racism a couple of years back, and then had to quickly reverse course when they saw that that was quite unfitting, when a certain TV host used it to then say that Jews weren't targeted for being Jewish. That definition of racism doesn't really fit and probably shouldn't be adopted by a Jewish organization that set out to combat anti-Semitism. So to get those,
I mean, you're talking about the ADL, I'm assuming, right?
Anyway.
Yeah, everyone knows about it. I mean, I remember the
yeah. No, but it's easy to see that once you accept the ideology, of course you're going to go down that track. And so for Jewish organizations who, at least their top three, I would hope their first mission should be to help counter and combat anti-Semitism, adopting ideas that then fuel anti-Semitism is kind of maybe something they shouldn't do. So that's one of the things we do at JILV. And the other thing is to look and work with the non-Jewish world to do the same thing. But in order to do it with the non-Jewish world, it would be a lot easier if we also have other Jewish organizations that acknowledge and recognize the problem, so that we don't get the non-Jewish world saying things like, well, this Jewish organization actually said it's fine, so it's okay. Then you get them feeding into and kind of tokenizing the as a Jews, like JVP and the like.
Yeah. The way I see it, the Jewish organizations, not all of them, but the mainstream ones that are combating anti-Semitism, still embrace woke ideology, right? In that they still embrace the philosophy that puts everyone into two categories, the oppressor and the oppressed. And most of these Jewish organizations don't seem to have a problem with that dichotomy. Their only complaint is where Jews are placed into that dichotomy, right? They want Jews to be placed into the oppressed classification, when in fact the entire system is absurd.
Exactly. And I think part of that is, and this could completely be an unfair characterization, but it appears to me that part of that is a little bit of laziness. It's a little bit lazy to assume that the people that the ideology characterizes as being oppressed want to be categorized that way. And so instead of saying, wait a minute, it's feeding into stereotypes if we say that Black people are oppressed and have no power, no agency. It's feeding into stereotypes actually that white supremacists use to justify things like slavery, when they believed and fed the idea that, well, Black people were actually like children, so they had to take care of Black, and had to keep Black people in the system of slavery. Instead of challenging that idea, you're right, there's a leaning in, as long as it's wait, just at least put us over there too. And the whole binary is problematic.
Yeah. No, I think the ADL is a perfect example of an organization that does that. I don't necessarily agree with Adam that every Jewish organization does this. I doubt the Zionist Organization of America buys into woke.
I did say everyone. In fact, the ZOA is one of the ones that came to mind as one that does not.
But I mean, the ADL, it's clear, and this is why Greenblatt's hated by everybody. Because he will criticize anti-Semitism from both sides of the spectrum, but he does it in such a way to try, in his mind, offend as least people as possible. But he ends up offending everybody with what he does, because he does play into woke ideology. He certainly does. Again, with the definition of racism they adopted.
I don't know how much it's him as a person or the structure of the organization, because to be fair, there are a lot of people that did come on board that organization that held this ideology. So once you're kind of steering that ship and you have
Yeah.
the lieutenants behind you that are leaning one way, it makes it a little bit difficult to write it when you see that it's leaning. And I think that it can be part of the problem, which we see in many organizations, not even just, mainstream Jewish organizations. I think that's one thing that we see at schools. I think that we have a lot of school administrators that are relatively moderate and rational, with a lot more in the class teachers who are more radicalized because they're coming out straight out of radicalized teachers' colleges.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a problem with a lot of orgs, and I haven't been on the inside of many of them, but I think that's true. And for instance, not Jewish Voice for Peace. What's the alternative to AIPAC? What are they called? I'm drawing a complete
J
blank.
Street.
Yeah, J Street. My understanding of J Street is that the upper leadership is, relatively moderate. They're very naive in every idea that they put forth. But my understanding is that in the lower ranks, they're incredibly radical and much closer to JVP on the spectrum than they are. But at above, two-state solution, et cetera, but that's not what's going on, underneath.
And I mean, it's going to take it hard work to address that the problem is the ideology, that the binary is a problem, and it's not just a problem because of how I'm defined, but it's a problem because it can lead to all of these other things. And in fact, we've seen it. And it takes work to address that. It's easier just to kind of keep going along and riding the wave of the ideology, which I'm afraid many organizations are doing.
And I think
Yeah.
that the EL was doing this long before Greenblatt, even as far back as Abraham Foxman's early
Really?
days with the ADL. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always been a progressive organization, and they fail to recognize who our friends really are, right? And just and castigate our actual friends, and at the same time want to be closer to the progressive left. I mean, in a time when the word woke didn't even exist. It was
I mean,
something more.
I don't know, because I don't think that there's anything wrong with an organization being liberal, or just like there's nothing wrong with an organization being conservative. It's when are you placing being liberal or being conservative above what your mission is supposed to be? Where you're placing it, like if you're placing it to where, okay, I'm a liberal organization, I believe in all of these other liberal policies. And so is that going to mean that I'm going to ignore the anti-Semitism that's coming from people who hold the same political ideology? Like that's when it becomes a problem. I see nothing wrong with
I was never, no, I'm not suggesting that they should have ever been a conservative organization if they don't feel that way, if they don't feel conservative. But they refused even back then to see conservatives as the natural allies of Jews. And if they don't see that, then they're kind of abandoning their cause of.
Well, you see, the issue is that when groups like the ADL, when was the ADL founded? In the 1920s or so? When they were founded, their mission, which was a dual mission, universal human rights and the Jewish people as an oppressed people who are entitled to, full liberation or whatever you want to call it, including an establishment of a state. The values or the views that they espoused aligned with what was considered to be domestic social justice at the time. And I think that was true right through the civil rights era. And then in the late 1960s, you have a beginning of a shift, and the left becomes militantly anti-Israel. And then it progresses over a few more decades. And then, what for shorthand I will call woke or intersectionalist social justice comes to dominate the left. And this dual mission of the ADL now becomes contradictory. Right? They can't be aligned with both social justice and allegedly universal human rights, and at the same time be Zionists, because that's not acceptable on the left anymore, but it was 50 years ago.
I think also part of the problem is that ideology isn't liberal. It's not a liberal ideology what came out of the liberal order post civil rights era. The idea that only one perspective needs to be embraced, it's not a liberal idea.
So when did that happen though, exactly?
I think what you said, I think in the late 60s when
Yeah.
militancy arrived, which again, militancy in itself is not a liberal idea. Not saying it's a conservative idea, but militancy is not a That's not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of liberalism.
Yeah, and I like that you guys use the word liberal here because there's a misunderstanding, and I think on the right it's deliberate to conflate left and liberal, and they're just simply not the same thing. The left in this country today is extremely illiberal in every respect in terms of race and ethnicity. They're hierarchical, and the alleged victims are being put on top. And if you're white, and Jews, of course, are, quote, hyper white. We're deeply complicit in white supremacy, and we're not entitled to a voice because we're oppressors, right? And that's so anti-liberal in every respect.
Well, Dennis Prager makes the distinction between the left and the liberal.
Well, I'm glad he does, at least. I mean, because a lot of people on the right don't do that. And I'm talking about the average guy. I have conversations with people here, and they start going on about liberals, and say, you're not talking about liberals here. You're talking about the left. I'm a liberal. Right? I'm open to diversity of opinions. I believe in meritocracy, but of course now they say meritocracy is a tool of white supremacy. So you can't win an argument if you hold that view. If you say I believe that people who merit promotion should get their promotion, you're automatically a racist for that. And it's absurd because I have family who had to deal with quotas at universities as late as the 1950s. My uncle, great uncle, who just died a few days ago, was 96 years old, and he became one of the top specialists in nuclear medicine, whatever the hell that is, in Canada. He did not get into McGill. And I guess it would be probably the late 40s, McGill's medical program, which was probably the best in Canada at the time, because Jews needed a GPA that had to be at least 0.2, higher compared to non-Jews. So he had to go somewhere else. So, to tell people who were, literally oppressed in certain ways, as late as the 1950s, and of course, I'm not comparing this to African Americans whatsoever, but there's degrees of oppression, of course. But to suddenly have them in the category of being oppressors, pure and simple, it's so utterly illogical. I mean, things can't change so quickly.
I think the whole game of the oppression Olympics is ridiculous, and it doesn't get us anywhere. I don't think it's to make it that the game is to win the trophy for being the most oppressed and most victimized is getting us nowhere. It's a ridiculous game in itself. And I think that the idea that, well, you have to put on all of your badges of oppression in order to have a voice in a certain space is part of the problem. In fact, I think it's the entire problem. And I just don't want to play that game.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, Jews were supposed to be good at playing the victimhood Olympics, and we seem to be losing now. Peter Novick, the historian from Chicago, who he's written a lot of controversial. He died, but he wrote a lot of controversial books. One of them was a complete attack on the discipline of history as practiced in America. But his other book, The Holocaust in American Life, he said it's really all about victimhood Olympics, and it's been that way since after World War II. And the Jews are winning it because they keep bringing up the Holocaust, and it's now become ingrained in the collective memory of Americans. And he wrote this in the late 90s, early 2000s. He didn't, had he written it in the 2020s, I mean, his view would be confirmed, but he'd probably have a different opinion about the place of the Jews in the whole thing, because we certainly aren't winning the victimhood Olympics at this point. But he was really very predictive.
But Brandy, I don't think we should have to play this victimhood.
Of course not. No, I'm not suggesting it's a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, though, with the Jews, I mean, we use our sense of humor here, and we're great about it. And Adam, that's why I told you to watch that Curb episode. I don't know if you've seen. Are you a fan of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Brandy?
I haven't seen it. My uncle watches it and quotes it often and laughs to himself because I've never seen it.
But they make fun of this whole of all the Jewish stuff, and including the victimhood Olympics. There's a great episode, spoiler alert for people who haven't watched it, where Larry is having a dinner because he's renewing his wedding vows with his wife, and the rabbi asks if he could bring a friend of his over who's, quote, a survivor. And Larry said, yeah, sure, absolutely. So Larry says, maybe I'll invite my father's friend who's a survivor. I'll bring him here. And he says, do survivors want to meet each other? Do they talk about the old days? Do they reminisce? What do they do when they see each other? So he's really contemplating something that's very profound and important. And it turns out the guy the rabbi brought was from the TV show Survivor. And he was one of the famous guys who lost in Australia and made a big stink about it. And they get into a whole argument at the dinner table. Who had it worse? Him as surviving in Australia and him surviving in a concentration camp. And, the guy finally says, have you ever seen the show? And the Holocaust survivor gets up and he says, did you ever see our show? It was called The Holocaust. And it's just a perfect example of Jews making fun of the whole victimhood Olympics thing. And the interesting thing, just to stick on the show for a while and how brilliant it is, right before the rabbi brings up inviting the survivor, Larry sees a picture on his desk, and the rabbi said, "That's my brother-in-law. He perished in 9/11." And Larry goes, "Oh my God, was he in the towers?" And he says, "No, he was uptown. He was a bike courier, and he got hit by a car on his bicycle." So apparently, if you happen to get killed in New York on 9/11, that made you part of the tragedy, right? So you could claim victimhood status. So again, that plays into that whole, this whole victimhood competition is utterly absurd. So I guess we Jews are good at, making jokes about it, which is terrific. But in terms of actually fighting, the war as it's transpiring now, I'm not sure we're that good at it, because we seem to be losing in many ways.
I mean, I think the more people lean into wanting to play, the more difficult it's going to be to actually win. Part of it is really walking away, but it's not just Jews that should not want to play the game. There's been no other time I can think of, at least in modern American history, where people have been wanted other people to view them as weak or victims.
Well, that's the big question. Do we play the game? Do we play the DEI game and try to present ourselves as victims? And your colleague David Bernstein did say on our show that, yeah, in some cases we should be doing that. I remember I was at a conference for a Zionist activist organization. I'm not going to name any names here whatsoever, but someone was giving a presentation on how to work with DEI officers at the various universities. And then a scholar, top scholar in Jewish studies, who was there, got up and he just completely lashed out and said, "We should not be playing this stupid game, and we should walk out and we should completely denounce DEI because the whole thing is utterly ridiculous." Which was fine for him because he was on the verge of retiring and he could just, walk away from all this. But again, it's a question. And if you look at Jewish history, especially in the 19th century, even in places like Russia, Jews are very good at working with the system that they find themselves in. Maybe they're trying to challenge it from within in various ways, but they're very good at using the system to ensure that they're able to get what they need out of it. And that goes, again, I'm no expert on this topic, but even the founding of the NAACP, which was in part founded by Jews. I mean, it took someone who was not part of the oppressed community that they were speaking on behalf of to be able to have the agency to work the system in order to, set something like that up. So, there is a big question here about to what extent do we fight the system, or to what extent do we try to manipulate it and hope for change afterwards.
I differ a little bit on DEI, only because if the purpose of DEI is to play the oppressor versus oppressed game, I think it's a ridiculous idea.
Oh, I agree with you on that. No, I'm in principle anti-DEI, but if it's there, I don't know what to do about it. I have a job at a university, and in many respects I have to do what they say. In terms of that, I'm not going to go openly fight whatever the policy is. That said, our state has taken steps to eliminate DEI in terms of employment and admissions to universities, and that's, if anything, that's the only thing that's come out of this Republican government at the state level that I have approved.
Didn't they add a fourth letter?
What?
Didn't they add a B to the DEI?
Oh, there's no letter?
Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness, right?
And sometimes the J, justice.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What's with these groups? They keep adding how many letters are there after LGBT now? There's at least like 3 or 4 more letters with a plus sign, following it. It seems rather endless. Yeah. So concretely speaking, how do you engage with the groups that you try to work with? What do you do specifically in terms of that?
I think part of it is when you come across a program that seems to possibly be doing damage, fueling anti-Semitism, or just a bit nonsensical. The first thing I want to know is what's the purpose of the program. So talking about DEI, well, what's the point of it? Honestly, like, what's the point of the maybe you can't speak to this, but what's the point of DEI policy at the university where you teach?
Well, I'm not going to speak about my university, because if anything can get you in trouble on, in academia, it's talking about your own institution. But again, I'm in a very politically neutral, apathetic, campus, and I'm very happy about that. At the moment, it gives me a lot of leeway in, fighting, for the Zionist cause, and I don't have to really worry about pushback on my campus. But DEI in many respects is clearly performative. right? There are a lot of people up there who just want to, the administration is just going to go. I mean, university administrators, fear two things, right? Bad press and, the loss of money. I mean, those are the two things that they really care about, and they need to fill seats in their classrooms and all that.
Well,
So
David Bernstein, your colleague, made an interesting distinction between DEI and DEI light. And the DEI light, describes more what you're referring to, that it's more performative, and they do it for the image of it, for the perception that they're doing something and care about their students of color. But then there's
much of it's performative, because I don't think it works in practice. I really don't think it actually works.
I know that, but I think that there's the hard DEI that actually they're true believers. They actually want to change the structure of a university campus
and society as a whole. But I don't think they're the ones running the universities. I mean, you'll get them in departments, but I don't think they're the ones. The university administrators are gonna go with the wind. And
what does Brandy think? She's our guest.
I think that it depends on the context. No, I'm kidding. I think it depends. Actually, it does depend a little bit on the university. If you have a university that has administrators that are courageous and rational people, I'm sure they try to limit the impact of the true believers in DEI, where those get limited to specific departments. But some of those departments are the ones that have the most students, the ones who graduate students that are going to have the most impact. Again, departments of, schools of education, and their departments that maybe bring in the most money for a university, depending on how many students go there. So even if the overall university administration is taking a pretty rational stand on DEI, if those departments are the ones that hold a lot of power, it gets a little bit out of balance. I'm, for one, not against DEI just on its own, but I look at it from a little bit of a different perspective. When I think about DEI, the first thing that I think about isn't race. I work for the military. I think about people with disabilities. I think about my workplace that had to build a wheelchair ramp because we hired somebody who was in a wheelchair. So when I think about the I in inclusion, it's like, okay, we did not have this person, anybody working for us before who had mobility issues. Now we do. We need to make a more inclusive environment. They need to be able to get into the building. I don't think, like, not the how it's been twisted. It's ridiculous. I think it's fueling a lot of bigotry and anti-Semitism. But more importantly, the results aren't there. It's not resulting in anything positive. And it holds too much power. When entire curricula are driven by DEI, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's what I see happening in a lot of universities. If you look on applications for job positions, and there are DEI statements in there that the applicants have to meet, that's a problem. And because those DEI statements have nothing to do with merit. They have nothing to do with whether this person is qualified for this position. That's the virtue signaling I see in kind of I can pat myself on the back.
Or at the very least, it's limiting the meritocracy because it limits the pool, right? If it's a DEI position where they're going to say they're only going to hire an African American, there'll be a lot of people who certainly merit the job who will be applying, but the number of people who merit it will be far more limited. And the end result will be as if summer 2020, every university in the country wanted to hire a Black woman after everything that happened, which in and of itself is fine, if they're qualified. But if you're dealing with a limited pool and you end up, which is a rarity in academia, with more demand than supply, well, what happens, if the supply runs out and you're going to have to take someone who otherwise would not have gotten an academic position just in order so they could check off that box? I mean, that's doing a disservice to the students. It's doing a disservice to the person themselves. And it's doing a disservice to the reputation of African American people who, students will then come to think are only getting these jobs because they're Black and not because they merit it. And clearly we see their performance here that they do not merit, having this job. So it's a no-win situation for anyone in the end. It really harms the whole system and the educational process. Yeah, and again, in terms of what you're saying with the curriculum, and I think I've said this before, I think it's a difference here between affirmative action and DEI, because at least affirmative action in its early days, the goal was to level the playing field in order so everyone could, rise up, and then a person will be a person, and that'll be the end of the whole thing. But with DEI, they want to institutionalize racialism and difference, right? They want to make it a point that this is something that has to be taught and, kept in place even once if we have achieved equality, right? We're going to teach this oppressed thing even after it ends as still being, relevant and something that we need to think about and judge people according to. That's my sense, at least. Do you agree? Since you're one of the experts on this?
I think I think that it is definitely there to kind of keep this binary front and center. And there's this idea that popped up, how many years back now when Kendi first, his book first came out, and it started perpetuating the idea that racism in the United States has never been as bad as it is today. And so we have to, with urgency, do something about it. And I think that really led to the boom in the DEI industry, the DEI bureaucracy, where DEI policies, very highly racialized DEI policies, were influencing everything. And the problem that I see with that is, one, it's based on a lie. I would do a disservice to my grandparents if I said I had experienced more racism than they did. My papa born in 1926 in Mississippi and my grand born in 1933. That would be insane for me to assume that I am experiencing more racism today than they experienced when they were my age.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But that idea has to be put front and center. That lie has to be put in front and center in order for any of it to make sense. If we look at DEI, like, again, what's the purpose? If it's my position is DEI programming should be used to improve intercultural communication and interactions. There are people that come from different backgrounds than you. It's not all based on color, that may see things a different way or communicate in a different way. The assumption shouldn't be that it's something negative towards you. It's okay, so how do we work better together? How do we understand each other better? Plain and simple. What are things that we didn't consider? A wheelchair ramp. All right, now that we know, put it in. Shouldn't be that, like, it shouldn't be have the vitriol that it carries, where everybody has to apologize for their real or perceived privilege, or be shamed into now trying to take on these badges of oppression so they can be included in the cool kids club.
Yeah, I don't. The fact that you need an ideology just to get to the point where you need to put in a wheelchair ramp is a little bit, absurd, right? I mean, that's the inclusion part, and the inclusion part's great. There's nothing, wrong with that. But when you get to the diversity and the equity, it starts to then you get to the issues where meritocracy.
Problem is when you got to put in a wheelchair ramp when there's nobody there with a wheelchair, right? And
Right.
but if you have somebody that works there in a wheelchair, obviously that's an accessibility accommodation that I don't see a problem with. But the other thing is that there's inequalities between groups, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's racism that causes them, right? A lot of differences. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing if university administrators want to try to look into these kinds of inequalities to figure out solutions to them. For example, at my university, we have a fair number of African American freshmen, but we don't have very many African American seniors. Right, that somewhere along the line they drop out. Why? Why do we graduate so few African Americans? Right? What is going on here? I don't really see a problem with the university wanting to address this and put resources towards it. Not only because of it's a social responsibility to do that, we also have an interest in making sure that our students are graduating. Right? So to just automatically say it's racism and that we must have a racist structure at our campus is absurd. There's other explanations for this. What do you think?
Yes, and there's a difference between saying that racism is determinative and racism is influential. Has racism influenced certain aspects of certain communities' well-being and lifestyles? Yeah. Is it a determining factor? Because racism exists, does that mean that no Black person has ever achieved anything and will never achieve anything because we're built on America's built on a racist foundation? That's the ideology that I counter and work to counter. Has racism influenced the experiences of Black Americans in this country? Yeah. It's just a lie to say it's a determining factor, because we know it isn't, because we have examples of many, many, many people who overcame racist obstacles and became, some of the greatest people our country has ever known. And I think that's a bit of the distinction. So you can look at, okay, what we have a pretty sizable incoming class of Black students. We have a very small graduating class of Black students. What's happening along the way? Can a lot of it be, well, some of those students can't afford to continue because tuition's high. And we have generations of Black people who on them, by mean, they come from less socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds. Yeah. And there are reasons for that. Does that mean that we can't then put supports in place, financial supports in place, scholarships to help those kids graduate? Of course. Are we accepting a lot of Black students who come from schools that didn't prepare them academically for the scholarship that they need in order to see their way through their undergraduate degree? Possibly. What supports can be put in place? And are those supports then available to all students? Because there are also other student populations, non-Black student populations, that also don't necessarily come into the university with the level of scholarship necessary to graduate. And to me, again, that's the difference. When you make, okay, we're going to have tutoring and it's only for Black kids. Okay, well, if it's for my Black kids have every academic advantage known to anyone in this country. So they're going to take the place of a white kid who may not, simply because of their skin color. That's when it's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, so you got to put mechanisms in place to address these things, but they can't be so ideologically rigid where they're going to exclude other people, who might need them. And I've got so many first generation college students, white, who come from rural areas in North Carolina. The parents didn't go to college. Parents are not even in favor of college necessarily. They want them to just go on and live their rural lives as generations of their family did. But they wanted an education, and they came. And they have it really tough. They don't have any familial supports, and they probably have to take a job to do it. But they're just regular white people. So there aren't any of these special, programs in place at many universities for people such as that. And I'm sure you found that too, Adam, with your school. Yeah. So how does anti-Semitism figure into all this? And it's not, it seems to have taken the form of anti-Zionism. And at this point, I've concluded that I personally have concluded that anti-Zionism is just an expression of anti-Semitism, and it's just the rhetoric and the discourse that they're using in order to voice things that are far beyond the criticism of one state or even the problem of the existence of one state. In your experience, how do you find the place of the Jews and anti-Semitism within this whole rigid ideological structure?
I think that if you accept the premise that all power is gained by exploitation, then people with real or perceived power must be the exploiters. And so we already know the stereotypes and tropes about Jewish power and privilege. So that must mean that Jews gained that real or perceived power and privilege by ill means. And then you put that on top of Israel, where you have this teeny tiny nation surrounded by powerful enemies that every time the enemies has tried to defeat the nation, they've been defeated. And teeny tiny Israel has won. So in the mind of people who accept that ideology, Israel's become the Goliath, and the surrounding Arab states and Muslim states have become the David, and they have to root for the underdog. Because Goliath, by essence of being powerful or perceived as powerful, is in the wrong. I think that's only one part of it. I think the other part of it really is founded on the idea of the Red-Green Alliance. There is Islamist ideology and there's neo-Marxist ideology that are inherently anti-Semitic, because in that they're, just to simplify, in their beliefs, Jews can't be powerful. Jews can't be stronger because they believe we don't deserve to be. And so every expression of Jewish power, whether that's through knowledge or actual physical power or military might, is something that has to be crushed.
But why is it that we don't deserve power, and assuming other people do?
Well, in Islamist ideology, part of it is because Jews were the first rejecter of their prophet.
Mhm.
I mean, it's really based in religious ideology that gets ignored in the context of the conversation about contemporary anti-Semitism that we're seeing today. The fact that the Jewish people reject that the Jewish people represent the first people who rejected Islam has carried through the centuries.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I really think that that's part of the foundation of Islamist ideology. It's a conquering ideology. It's an imperialistic ideology that is sought to conquer and take over and settler colonize many, many places around the world. Again, and this is a part of me as a therapist. I don't need to reject the ideology. That's not the first session. The first session is to, okay, even if what you say is true, this is where maybe you're misguided. So even if we accept that we should lean into decolonization and land back, and everyone who's not a part of the indigenous people should go back to where their ancestors came from, that would lean into Zionism. The idea of Jews as an indigenous people settling in the land of their ancestors. So there's something about that there's a disconnect from people who are waving their banners to, decolonize Palestine using a colonizer's name for a land. I mean, there are multiple ways that it's just so ridiculous. If it weren't, and I would laugh if it weren't so dangerous, but we've seen how many people have been hurt and murdered and still held hostage because of it. So it is a dangerous ideology, even though it's so ridiculous that it is also laughable. They're calling to decolonize the land using a name that was given to the land by colonizers.
Yeah.
It's insane. So that's the part of Islamist ideology. At its root, it's supremacist. So any supremacist thinks that they deserve everything and everyone else is second-class citizens and deserve nothing.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess it's sort of true of Christianity too, at least, before the modern period. Because, I mean, the Jews were the first rejectors of Christianity. I mean, obviously that's a bit of a simplification since the first Christians were Jews. But, and added to that is they're responsible for the death of Christ. So there is this fear of Jewish power, going all the way back to the early Middle Ages, and beyond that, the Jews were supposed to have disappeared. And if the Jews retained, there must be something going on here, that they're still here. They must have some sort of power. They're engaged in this covert plot to destroy Christendom, and that morphs into modern anti-Semitism at some point about global Jewish conspiracies. And it aligns very well with, the Hamas's charter. They fluidly go from Islamism into, pretty much direct quotes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and back into Islamism without a problem. It's really one of the most anti-Semitic documents in history.
Right.
Yet the Jews are the ones who are being accused of, Zionist fundamentalism and, of, colonizing all these places. Yeah. And they're the ones with the genocidal intent. It's so absurd to read that Israel has genocidal intent when just based on a few offhanded comments from some ministers in the Israeli government reacting out of anger after 10/7, whereas Hamas actually has what for all intents and purposes is a constitution calling for the genocide of the Jewish people.
And not just Hamas. I mean,
of course, yeah.
Looking at the regime in Iran, that I think that in looking at other states and other political leaders in the surrounding countries, and if we're not going, the only way we're actually going to be able to counter and tackle anti-Semitism is if we acknowledge and recognize the where it's coming from.
Mhm.
And if we're not willing to talk about Islamist supremacist ideology and how it's fueling contemporary anti-Semitism, we're going to be having the same conversation and fighting the same wars generations down the road.
We're not allowed to talk about that.
Well,
that's
We're only allowed to talk about the Christian, the white Christian, white supremacists.
Yeah, you're only allowed to talk, about or criticize people who are higher up than you on the oppressor ladder. And, obviously white supremacists are higher, at least for now, than the Jews are on the ladder of oppression. So if it's coming from neo-Nazis, we can criticize them. And all the activists are willing to fight it. But if it's coming from brown people from the Middle East, then forget it. They're oppressed. You have no business criticizing what is, quote, a legitimate act of resistance. On the other hand, as an African-American woman, perhaps if you want to do your as of this, you know, as like a lot of Jews do the as a Jew thing. You know, you come from, you know, a more, you know, quote, oppressed community than they do. So that sort of puts you in a position of advantage, and you could probably say
Position
things.
of power. No.
Well, it translates into power. It's oppression empowers people today, right? So if you want to play the game, or at least you're probably given a certain immunity that people like Adam.
Victimhood is currency.
Yeah, currency. Adam and I do not have that currency as, you know, quote, white males. Yeah.
I actually do not, because that's where the invention of the four eyes of oppression come in. I must be expressing internalized white supremacy if I think that.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
No, I don't do or I won't do an as a Black Jew. Instead, I'm going to do an as a woman of a certain age. I don't have time for the nonsense, and I'm going to say what you know, I said what I said. I challenge anyone to follow the timeline of history and show me where I'm wrong. And this isn't, again, that it doesn't have to be just like I would never demonize all Christians. I'm not going to demonize all Muslims. There is an ideology, an Islamist ideology that is supremacist. They say so. Like, you don't have to listen to me. They say it. The Hamas charter says it. The Ayatollahs and leaders of the Iranian regime say it. So I'm not going to beat around the bush and pretend that what's true isn't to make some people happy and make some people feel better.
I like the way that you say of a certain age, because I think we should frame this as a rebellion of Generation X, who are entirely, you know, rational, reasonable people against what the younger millennials started to introduce and have now made, you know, their official ideology to indoctrinate people with.
It's shocking to me that we're the rational generation, right? We were not supposed to be. That's why we're called Gen X in the first place.
We're everything that we're not supposed to be. Gen X has been defeating the odds. Look at that.
Yeah, no, our parents let us do whatever the hell we wanted, and we did. And I think it actually worked out in the end. Whereas millennials and certainly Gen Z have a much more rigid, you know, structure in their life, and perhaps that translates into their ideology. But it's interesting with Islamism, you know, I have found, at least in my encounters with Muslims in this country, it's not the immigrants who voice things like that. It's actually their children. The Muslim children who are born in this country, who somehow tap into some sort of combination of what they came from, coupled with the leftist woke ideology, you know, that's prevalent in this country, and they've somehow managed to, you know, amalgamate the two. So I guess in a certain respects, it's you know, children of all immigrants kind of look back and want to identify more with their country of origin than their parents who left. But it's playing into the woke ideology today in such a way, right? I mean,
it's easy to romanticize something that you never had to experience. I think that we see that with the young people romanticizing Osama bin Laden on TikTok and romanticizing communism. They've never had to stand in a bread line in sub-zero temperatures.
Yeah, no, it's utterly absurd. Yeah, well, Bernie Sanders is not of this millennial generation, and he still, you know, gave a nice speech about how wonderful the subways in Moscow are in 1988, right before the entire system collapsed.
But he doesn't get much support from his age group. It's the millennials and Gen X and Gen Zers that are flocking towards him.
That is true. Yeah,
The subways were beautiful.
They absolutely are. You know, they're beautiful, and their subways run on time. You know, there's a clock in every subway station that says how long it'll be till the subway gets there, and it arrives in that time.
Subways where?
In Moscow, and St. Petersburg, and many Kiev, and many of the other cities of the former Soviet Union. They're beautiful. They're works of art. These stations, beautifully designed and built, mostly in the 1930s, and they are just the cleanest place in Russia. I'm being very literal about that. I mean, you know, the country's otherwise filthy. So you have been over there, right?
Yeah, we've been a few times. I mean, nothing recent, of course, and
yeah, no,
not again, but
it'll be a long time before, you know, the Americans really get back in there. And given that the familial connections, it would be ill-advised for anyone in your family to go over there, because they might not be let out, you know, after.
I think more my husband being a Navy veteran here, maybe it's not a good idea to plan a family trip.
Yeah, no, there's other places that you know, that you could probably go to that would be much more enjoyable at this point. Well, we're nearing the hour mark. Does anyone have any last words that they want to say? Adam, is there anything you want to throw out there at this point?
No, I'm good. I'm still wondering why your beard is different colors from your mustache, though.
Well, that's funny how facial hair works that way. You know, and
Ah.
my hair isn't gray and my beard is gray.
Oh,
And
all right.
we can do an episode on this if you want, but I could even,
Should.
I can shave on camera if you really want to. Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay.
If we run out of stuff to talk about, then we will head in that direction. All right. Well, Brandy, anything else you want to add?
No, I'm good. Thank you for inviting me on.
Absolutely, absolutely, and
Coming on.
look forward to seeing great work from JILV in the future, and JSCN is more than happy to collaborate with your organization as we have been,
Mhm.
and continue to do so.
Brandy is also a signer of JSCN's statement as well.
She is, yeah, and we hit the 200 mark a few weeks ago, so that's good. I mean, it's still not as good as the people trucking out the elephant in the room statements that get thousands of signatures, but
Yeah, well, the 300th signer gets a free bowl of borscht.
Red or
are you going to make the borscht?
Mm-hmm.
You know how to make borscht?
No, but I can learn.
Okay. I don't really like borscht. I don't like East European Jewish food.
Well, you won't be the 300th signer then.
I won't be, yeah. And I wouldn't accept the borscht anyway. I don't want
You
it.
don't like borscht with sour cream in
I
there?
don't like cold Jewish food. I don't like Russian food. Their food sucks. The further north and the further east you go in Europe, the worse the food gets. Okay, that's a general rule. I like Sephardic food. Our local
I do
Chabad
too.
rabbi is actually
Sephardic food
married
is
to a
better.
Sephardic Jew, and you go to the Chabad house, you get one of the best meals in the world
Sephardic
because
food
she's
is
Sephardic.
better. Yeah.
Hmm? Yeah, Middle Eastern food, good spicy food. And you're not going to get that in Russia, and you're not going to get that in American Jewish homes whose families came from Russia. It's
And
just
you're not going to get that for being the 300th signer. You're going to get borscht.
okay. Well, all right, borscht
All
on.
right.
All right, well, we're going to sign off. This is Jared, Adam, and Brandy saying good night.
All right.